Clara Mitchell had spent 3 quiet years behind the mess hall counter at Forward Operating Base Falcon, a slab of concrete and steel rising from the Afghan desert like an island of order in a sea of dust and chaos. And to anyone watching her ladle stew or pour coffee, she was nothing more than the calm woman in the hairnet who set breakfast at 0600, lunch at noon, and dinner as the sun burned low at 1800. Her movements steady, her voice soft, her eyes lowered in polite routine. Yet beneath that quiet rhythm beat the instincts of a soldier who had once lived on the edge of war. Because before she became the cook everyone called Mom, she had been Staff Sergeant Clara Mitchell of the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the first women to complete the program, an airborne infantry prodigy who could navigate darkness and hit moving targets at distances that humbled her peers, but who had walked away from the front after a mission in Syria tore something human from her chest when she pulled a trigger and watched a boy far too young to hold a rifle fall. And in that single instant every medal she had ever earned turned to lead around her neck. So she asked to be reassigned, traded her rifle for a serving spoon, her missions for meal schedules, and convinced herself that feeding warriors was still a kind of service, a quieter one that did not stain her hands red. The SEALs stationed at Falcon didn't ask questions. Men like Commander Daniel Foster and his second-in-command Chief Louis Ortega knew better than to dig into another veteran's past, and they respected efficiency when they saw it. Clara's kitchen ran like a well-drilled platoon, her supplies inventoried to the ounce, her timing precise enough to synchronize watches by. They teased her good-naturedly, called her boss lady, and she smiled faintly without explaining that she had led combat teams twice the size of theirs, because humility came easier than memory. Yet even in this sanctuary she couldn't silence her habits. Each dawn before the first pot of coffee brewed, she walked the perimeter of her domain, studying exits, marking blind spots, noting which utensils could serve as weapons, and beneath the industrial freezer, hidden in waterproof wrapping behind old boxes of frozen meat, lay a small arsenal she hoped never to touch again. A personal insurance policy against the chaos that sometimes followed men with guns. That chaos arrived on an October morning that began like any other, the air heavy with the smell of fried eggs and diesel, the sound of laughter from a table of operators just back from patrol, until a low rumble rolled across the horizon followed by the sharper concussion of an explosion that didn't belong to any training drill. The building trembled, coffee cups rattled, and before the alarm even wailed, Clara knew it was the real thing. Her body remembered before her mind caught up, that old electric clarity flooding her senses, every detail sharpening into combat focus. Through the window she saw dust columns blooming from multiple directions, not random shelling but coordinated strikes hitting key points. The comms hub, the power grid, the command post. Someone had studied the base map. This was no insurgent lucky shot. When black-clad figures began moving through the smoke, their formations crisp, their weapons modern, she felt the old dread settle deep in her gut. These were professionals executing an infiltration, and when their vector turned toward the SEAL barracks, she understood their target long before anyone shouted orders over the radio. The kitchen erupted in panic, cooks diving for cover, trays crashing, but Clara's expression didn't change. She shut off the burners, pulled the apron over her head, and reached beneath the freezer. The metal was cold against her fingers as she unlatched the case she'd sworn never to open, and inside gleamed the tools of the life she thought she'd buried. A compact pistol, a combat knife, a headset, and a few devices that didn't exist on any inventory list. Outside, gunfire crackled, short disciplined bursts, and then silence heavy enough to choke the air. She peered through smoke-blurred glass and saw the unthinkable. Her SEALs, those hard-edged, unbreakable men, zip-tied and drugged, dragged toward armored trucks. They weren't killing them. They were taking them alive. Something inside her, dormant for years, roared awake. When the convoy disappeared beyond the ridgeline, Clara was already moving. She slipped through the chaos of wounded and shouting personnel, her steps quick but unhurried, blending in until she reached the comm center, where the few surviving techs struggled to re-establish contact with command. She took one look at the dark monitors and knew help would not come in time. The base was isolated by design, and with comms fried and the power grid down, the chain of command would take hours to react. Her hands flew over manual systems, pulling local backups, scanning data that confirmed her suspicion. The attackers had exploited a 40-minute gap between guard rotations, a detail known only to someone inside. That realization chilled her more than the explosions. Betrayal. Digging through encrypted logs, she traced unauthorized data transfers stretching back months, payments in offshore accounts under the name of Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Raw, the very man responsible for security. The betrayal was complete, but she had no time for outrage. Her people were gone, and she had less than a day to find them before they vanished forever. She ran probability maps through the remaining network, cross-referenced fuel capacity, terrain access, and historical insurgent routes until 3 possible sites emerged: a mine to the north, a cave system to the west, and an old Soviet compound to the east. The mine was too exposed, the cave too remote for vehicle transport, leaving one choice. Her decision was instant. There would be no waiting for reinforcements. Bureaucracy moved slow. Captivity killed fast. By sunset she was gone, slipping from the wounded base under cover of dust and wind, a shadow among wreckage, her pack stripped to essentials: water, ammo, med kit, rope, night optics, and the memories of how to kill quietly. The desert swallowed her without trace. For 6 hours she moved across rock and sand, guided by instinct more than maps, avoiding patrols, following faint tire tracks until the shape of the old Soviet installation rose like a bruise against the horizon. Rusted towers, cracked concrete walls, the ghost of an empire repurposed for another war. From a ridge she watched the guards, 30, maybe more, disciplined, rotating in predictable shifts. Their radios crackled in a language she only half understood, but their body language was universal, professionals guarding something precious. Through night vision glass she spotted them, 12 shapes in a central building, hands bound, movement restricted but alive. Relief threatened to weaken her knees. She crushed it down. Emotion could wait. She studied patrol patterns until fatigue slowed them, then began the approach. At 0300, she struck, a silent shadow slipping between floodlight cones, moving faster than human fear could register. One guard fell to a chokehold, another to a dart she improvised from kitchen needles dipped in tranquilizer stolen from the base infirmary. Each motion was efficient, quiet, final. She reached the comms hall, bypassed outdated Soviet locks with a digital override she'd carried for years, and slipped inside. The sight stopped her for half a breath. Commander Foster bound to a chair, head sagging, eyes blinking in disbelief when they lifted and met hers. Recognition flickered, disbelief following close behind. "Clara," he rasped, as if the cook materializing from the dark was some fever dream. "Not the cook," she whispered, slicing his bonds with one smooth motion. "Rangers don't retire. They just change kitchens." He almost smiled, but there was no time. Within minutes she'd freed the rest, Ortega last, his grin wide even through blood and bruises. "I knew you moved like someone who'd been shot at," he muttered. Weapons were scavenged from their captors, and together they slipped into the corridors as alarms began to stir. The fierce gunfire erupted when a guard stumbled onto their escape. It lasted only seconds but shattered the silence, drawing every enemy in range. What followed was chaos orchestrated by professionals, Clara leading with ruthless efficiency, the SEALs following as if she'd always been one of them. Bullets sparked off concrete, grenades thundered, but discipline carried them through. She detonated fuel drums as diversions, sealed corridors behind them with improvised charges, and led her people through a maintenance tunnel that spewed them out into the freezing night just before the compound erupted in flames. The march back to Falcon was hell. 12 exhausted men and one woman half their size guiding them through ravines and enemy territory, wounded but unbroken. When they reached Allied lines at dawn, the sun rising red over the desert, the look on the base commander's face could not decide between disbelief and awe. Reports were filed, investigations opened, promotions offered, and Clara's name slid across more than one desk at higher command, attached to words like valor, initiative, and extraordinary action. Yet she refused every medal, every reinstatement. "I'm not going back to war," she told Foster quietly. "I just couldn't let my family die." He understood, because warriors recognize the fatigue that medals cannot cure. Months later, while official channels buried the scandal and court-martialed the traitor, a new directive appeared in classified circles, an experimental program placing seasoned operators in plain sight at support posts, men and women who could blend into the background but act when everything else failed. Clara was the prototype. Her file was rewritten. Food service supervisor, unremarkable background, no combat clearance, on paper. In truth, she became the unseen first responder for elite units worldwide, stationed where risk simmered and trust mattered. 6 months after the Falcon siege, she stood in a different kitchen on another continent, stirring a pot while laughter echoed behind her, the same rhythm of trays and chatter, but now every commander who passed through knew that the quiet woman in the apron wasn't just a cook. She was the failsafe, the last defense between their people and disaster. Beneath the freezer in this new mess hall, wrapped in plastic once more, waited another case of tools, polished, silent, patient. She prayed she'd never need them, but hope, she'd learned, was not a plan. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the steel countertops, lines deeper, eyes calmer, and wondered how many lives she would touch without them ever knowing who had kept them safe. Some night she climbed to the roof after curfew, watched the stars hanging over whichever desert or jungle she now served in, and thought about that boy in Syria, the one whose death had driven her to seek peace. Maybe this was her penance, saving others in the quiet instead of taking life in the noise. SEAL Team 7 went back to operations with renewed fire, and though they never spoke publicly of what happened, every man on that team made it a ritual to stop by her line when they passed through Falcon or wherever she was transferred, offering a salute disguised as a joke or a story only she would understand. They still called her Mom, but the word carried a new weight, a mixture of reverence and affection reserved for someone who had walked through hell for them. Commanders debated giving her commendations she would never see, but Clara didn't care. Her satisfaction lived in the simple routine of service, the clatter of trays, the smell of coffee, the sound of boots at dawn. She'd found equilibrium at last, half warrior, half caregiver, both identities balanced like twin blades. She no longer dreamed of combat or blood. She dreamed of hands reaching for food, laughter echoing through the mess, lives moving forward because she'd kept them alive to do so. Sometimes, when new recruits grumbled about the food or asked why the cook always kept her back to the wall, Ortega would grin and say nothing, letting them believe she was just eccentric. Secrets, he'd learned, were safer that way. Only a few high-ranking officers knew about the quiet network of protectors forming under her example. Former operatives turned invisible guardians in maintenance, logistics, and medical units, each one trained to hold the line when everything else collapsed. Clara had unknowingly become the architect of a new doctrine, defense through deception, strength through silence. Her legend lived in sealed reports and whispered training lectures labeled Mitchell Protocol. And yet, if anyone had told her that she was changing the military's approach to security, she would have laughed. In her mind, she was still the woman who cooked breakfast and made sure everyone had enough coffee before missions. But fate has a way of testing resolve. A year after Falcon, during a deployment in Eastern Europe, another crisis struck, an attempted breach at a joint operations facility. By the time alarms sounded, Clara had already guided the base's personnel to safe zones, isolated the intruders, and coordinated local forces to intercept them before they could detonate explosives. When the dust settled, and her commanding officer asked how she'd known exactly what to do, she simply said, "Because I never stopped paying attention." After that, no one doubted her again. The term Mitchell readiness became slang for absolute vigilance. Years passed, wars shifted, faces changed, but Clara remained the constant. The quiet soul moving from base to base, unseen yet indispensable. Younger soldiers sometimes asked why she never took a higher post or retired. She'd just smile and say, "Someone has to make sure you all come home." In her heart, she knew she was doing more good now than she ever had in the field. She wasn't chasing glory. She was guarding those who would. Late one night, Commander Foster found her sitting alone after cleanup, staring at a faded photograph of the team taken years before. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. She shook her head. Not while they still need breakfast. They laughed quietly. Two veterans sharing and understanding words could never capture. History would never list her name among decorated heroes, and that suited her fine. The strongest walls, she believed, were built by people no one noticed. Somewhere beyond the wire, another generation of operators would go out into darkness, and she'd be there when they came back, steady, unflinching, ready with a plate and a watchful eye. In that, she had found peace. And if danger ever dared step through her kitchen door again, it would land too late that the calm woman in the apron was still, and would always be, a ranger at heart.